And Donald Trump has launched a sharp attack on Europe and its leadership, describing the continent as, quote, decaying and struggling under the pressures of migration while being led by weak politicians. In an extensive, wide-ranging interview with Politico following the release of the U.S.'s national security strategy last week, Trump also accused European leaders of failing to make progress in ending the war in Ukraine and refused to commit to support for Kiev. Trump said the continent relies on the U.S. for military backing, but said it is being, quote, destroyed from within.
I want to run the United States. I don't want to run Europe. I'm involved in Europe very much.
Might you endorse
NATO
candidates?
calls me daddy. I mean, I have a lot to say about it. Look, I raised, the GDP from 2% to 5%. The 2% they weren't paying and the 5% they are paying. And they're paying it because when we send things over, NATO pays for it, and I assume they give it to Ukraine. But Europe is being destroyed.
Well, the reaction from within Europe has been a mixture of shock, anger, and resolve. Sylvia has been tracking all the reaction this morning over the last 24 hours. Sylvia, how have European leaders reacted to Trump's comments?
So ultimately, they were not caught by surprise because it's not really new that we have witnessed these differences of opinion between the EU and the US. I would actually just remind our viewers that at the start of this year, we had the Vice President of the United States, J.D. Vance, making fiery remarks at the Munich Security Conference. And that really just started the relationship and just highlighted the tone of what we could see in this transatlantic alliance. But ultimately, though, the question from an investment point of view is whether, despite these differences of opinion, the EU and the U.S. can still work together. But in terms of the commentary that we have heard from, in terms of European officials, we did hear, for instance, from Antonio Costa, he's the president of the European Council, highlighting that the United States needs to respect the choice of European voters in a similar way to what Europe does when it comes to how American voters have chosen their president. Listen in.
We are allies with the United States. And allies must act as allies. That means that we should not interfere in the political, internal life of our countries. We respect the choice of Americans, and they need to respect the democratic choice of our citizens.
So this was perhaps the answer that we obtained in Europe that was more directly looking at the latest remarks from the President of the United States. But there's been several comments in recent days, also off the back of the National Security Review that was presented by the United States, which also had strong remarks when it came to the European Union. In that context, we heard, for instance, from the EU's top diplomat, that's Kaja Kallas, and she also chose to highlight that ultimately what she wants to do is to focus on the things that the US and the EU can do together. The bottom line here, and as I've highlighted also from an investment point of view, is whether, despite these political differences, the EU and the US can work together. So far, it seems that on the trade front, they have managed to overcome their differences. There is a trade compromise on the table. Of course, it's not a smooth situation. They're still having conversations about trade. You still hear American diplomats raising concerns about overregulation when it comes to tech in the European continent. But ultimately, it seems that this is more of a peace approach, portfolio by portfolio, rather than an overcome relationship when it comes to the transatlantic alliance. Bottom line, indeed, is how the European Union is choosing to highlight the positives here, that they're keen to work together with the United States, and they're choosing to perhaps put the noise coming from the Trump administration a little bit to the side, at least for the time being and for as long as they can.
When you put the comments into context of how President Trump has described other leaders around the world, I mean, yes, his words were harsh, but he also had some, positive words about Europe, saying he likes this current leadership in Europe. He knows them well, that he's friends with a lot of them. It was by no means the kind of public takedown that we saw between President Trump and President Zelensky back in the Oval Office, which to me suggests that he's trying to elicit a response from Europe, much like during the NATO, the height of the NATO, what would we call it, shakeout earlier this year with President Trump trying to get European leaders to spend more on defense. So to what extent is this really about fundamental divergence between the U.S. and Europe versus President Trump simply trying to get Europe to do more to support Ukraine to bring this conflict to an end, for example?
It's a fair point, because he also said that he wants Europe to succeed. The point here is that there's differences of opinion in terms of how Europe should succeed. In the eyes of the American president, it's taking one shape, and that, for instance, is restricting migration. That he's been very clear about that. From a European perspective, of course, it depends at which country you're looking at. The approach is different. Their idea of how to succeed and how to have a fruitful economy is different from the view that the President of the United States has. But this, of course, is hitting at a domestic issue. It's up for the Europeans to decide ultimately how they want to live. But, of course, the transatlantic relationship is very important. You highlighted there how the American president managed to put Europe at spending more on defense. So he has achieved that for sure. When it comes to trade, we also see a little bit of progress there as well. So it just seems that even though it is a complicated relationship, they are managing, at least to some extent, to get some stuff done. The question is, how do we move from here?